When the HOA ordered me to move my boat, they had no idea I legally owned the entire lake they were standing on. What started as a petty notice turned into their ultimate downfall. The envelope flapped against my boat's railing in the morning breeze. I thought it was trash at first, but no, it was official. Remove your vessel within 14 days. Noncompliance will result in fines. Signed by the HOA president, Harold Givens. I laughed. My family had docked boats on this lake for 3 generations. This HOA was barely 10 years old. I crumpled the notice and tossed it back on the dock, thinking it was some silly mistake. I didn't know this was just the beginning of a war. The second Friday of the month arrived with the kind of sticky summer heat that clung to clothes and skin like wet paint. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a hazy orange, the sun dragging its light low across the lake. The water reflected a sheet of gold, and my boat, a 30-foot fishing vessel I'd restored with my own hands, floated peacefully at its dock, its silhouette cutting across the glittering surface. That boat wasn't just metal and wood. It was history. My father had bought it when I was a boy, back when this lake was nothing more than a forgotten stretch of water surrounded by brush and farmland. We'd spent summers here before any of these neatly trimmed lawns, chain-linked fences, and homeowners association signs sprouted like weeds. The boat belonged here as much as the lake itself did. But now, apparently, it was an obstruction. The HOA held their monthly meeting in the community hall, a rectangular concrete box that smelled of dust, coffee, and the faint mustiness of old carpet. The air conditioner rattled against the far wall, fighting a losing battle against the crowd packed inside. Rows of plastic folding chairs were arranged in lines, every seat filled by residents in polos, sundresses, and sun hats, all murmuring in low tones as if the fate of the entire neighborhood was about to be decided. At the front, the board sat behind a long row of folding tables, elevated just enough to look down on the rest of us. They had name placards in front of them, as if we were at some kind of corporate summit. At the center sat Harold Whitaker, the self-declared president of the HOA. He was a man in his late 60s with a permanent frown carved into his jowls, his comb-over slicked down so aggressively it gleamed under the fluorescent lights. On either side of him sat the others. Martha with her rigid bun and pearl earrings, Tom with his ever-present sunglasses perched on his bald head. They thought of themselves as rulers. Not volunteers, not neighbors, rulers. I took a seat in the third row. A few eyes darted toward me, then quickly away. I wasn't exactly popular in these gatherings. The meeting dragged on with routine complaints, lawn heights, noise ordinances, some poor guy who painted his shutters the wrong shade of green. They reveled in their tiny scraps of power, each vote punctuated with gavel taps from Harold like he was running the Supreme Court. Then Harold's eyes landed on me. "Next order of business," he said, his voice booming with unnecessary self-importance. "Mr. Cole's boat." The room shifted. Dozens of heads turned toward me. I leaned back in my chair, expression unreadable, while Harold adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Your boat," he said, pointing a stiff finger in my direction as if he were accusing me of theft, has been the subject of repeated complaints. It obstructs the view from several properties around the lake. Residents feel it is unsightly. Murmurs rippled through the room. Some nodded. Others whispered, casting glances in my direction. I raised an eyebrow slowly. Unsightly? That boat's been on this lake longer than most of these houses. Be that as it may, Harold said, tightening his jaw. This community has standards. The boat must be relocated. It does not belong where it is currently docked. Relocated where? I asked, my voice calm even. That's for you to figure out. Martha chimed in with a clipped tone, her pearls catching the light. All we know is that residents pay good money for lakefront views, and right now, your boat is an eyesore. Laughter trickled from a few seats in the back. The kind of laughter people use when they think they're on the winning side. I let the silence hang for a moment. Then I leaned forward, folding my hands together on my knee. Tell me something, I said, my voice cutting through the whispers. Who do you think owns this lake? That got them. Harold blinked, momentarily thrown off, before smirking as if I'd asked the most ridiculous question in the world. The lake is public property, he said confidently, and as such, it falls under the purview of this association when it comes to community aesthetics. His certainty spread like wildfire. People chuckled, shook their heads, muttered about me being difficult. I could almost see the smugness rise in the room, a collective belief that they'd cornered me. I smiled faintly. Interesting. I stood, pushing back my chair with a scrape. Well then, I'll consider it. That was all I gave them. No argument. No shouting. Just enough to leave them confident in their superiority. As I walked toward the door, Harold called after me. We expect compliance, Mr. Cole. Don't make us escalate this further. I didn't answer. I stepped out into the thick summer air, the chorus of laughter still echoing behind me. The cicadas screamed in the trees. The lake shimmered in the distance, calm, unbothered, eternal. They thought they had power. They thought this lake was theirs to dictate over, to decorate with their rules and bylaws. But what they didn't know, the secret tucked neatly into my safe, sealed in documents dating back generations, was that my family had purchased this lake nearly a century ago. The water, the shoreline, the mineral rights beneath it, all of it belonged to me. They sat in their folding chairs like kings. But kings only matter if the land is theirs. And this land? This water? It was mine. I drove home without turning on a radio, the plan already forming in my head, sharp and deliberate. By the time I reached the cabin, the laughter from that hall had been replaced in my mind with something else, silence. A silence I would make them feel soon enough. The cabin was silent when I returned, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was the kind of silence that pressed in from all sides, broken only by the distant ripple of the lake outside. My neighbors had their HOA meetings, their laughter, their votes, but I had something they would never possess, proof. I walked straight to the study. The walls were lined with old cedar, the grain darkened by decades of tobacco smoke and oil lamps. My grandfather's hunting rifle still hung above the doorframe, polished and gleaming though it hadn't been fired in years. He'd been a man who believed in two things above all else, land and law. And tonight, both were on my side. I knelt before the safe tucked behind a false panel in the wall. The steel door was old but solid, painted black, the dial worn smooth by generations of turning. I spun the combination slowly, each number clicking into place with a satisfying finality. When the lock released, I pulled open the heavy door and felt the cool draft of preserved air. Inside were folders, documents, envelopes bound with twine, each one carrying the weight of decades. At the very back, protected in a fireproof sleeve, lay the one thing that mattered most, the deed. I slid it out carefully, as though I were handling something alive. The paper was yellowed with age, its corners brittle, its ink faded to sepia. Yet the words were still sharp, written in the ornate legal hand of a bygone era. I sat on the desk under the green glow of a banker's lamp and read it again, though I'd memorized every line long ago. This certifies the transfer of ownership of Lake Marrow and its adjoining water rights to Mr. Charles Cole, dated August 3rd, 1954. My grandfather. I could almost see him there in the room with me, his stern jaw set, his thick farmer's hands gripping the pen as he signed his name. He hadn't just bought sediment. Every inch of it was ours, passed down like an inheritance of power. The irony made me laugh under my breath. The HOA thought they controlled the lake because their houses faced it. They saw water and assumed it was theirs to regulate. But the law didn't bend to assumptions. It bent to ink and signatures, to seals stamped in courthouses decades ago. I ran a finger along the embossed county seal, still faintly raised on the page. That seal was ironclad. It meant that the entire body of water, every drop, every current belonged to me. Every fish, every dock, every reflection of their precious sunsets. They were swimming, boating, and fishing in my backyard, and they didn't even know it. I sat back in the leather chair, letting the weight of it sink in. The HOA had just declared war without realizing they were building their little kingdom on my battlefield. I reached for my phone, laid the deed flat, and snapped photos from every angle. Close-ups of the seal, shots of the signatures, wide frames of the entire page. Then I scanned it with my portable scanner, storing high-resolution digital copies in a folder labeled with a name only I would recognize. From there, I encrypted them and sent them to cloud storage, double-layered behind two-factor authentication. If anything happened to this paper, if some accident mysteriously consumed my cabin in flames, the proof would live on. Everywhere. Untouchable. The original deed, I slipped back into its protective sleeve, then into the safe, sealing it behind steel and silence. As the lock clicked shut, memories of my grandfather stirred. I could still recall being 10 years old, watching him sit at this very desk, oil lamp burning low, as he explained to me what it meant to own land. A man without land is a tenant in another story, he'd said, his voice graveled deep from years of tobacco. But when you own the ground under your feet, or the wall, at the time, I didn't fully understand. To a boy, it sounded like some old man's pride and property. But tonight, those words had teeth. Tonight, I understood what he'd meant. The HOA thought they had leverage. They thought rules and votes could outmuscle ownership. But rules crumble against deeds. Votes vanish against signatures. I poured myself a glass of bourbon from the decanter on the shelf and stared out the study window at the dark expanse of the lake. The moonlight painted silver ripples across the water, every shimmer a reminder of what was mine. The neighbor saw a lake for recreation. I saw a fortress, because control of water is control of life. Their sprinklers, their gardens, their pool filters, all of it drew from this lake. They thought of it as some shared luxury, but in reality, every drop they touched was borrowed. And borrowed things can be taken back. I sipped the bourbon slowly, the burn trailing down my throat. The plan wasn't finished yet, but it was forming. Piece by piece, like a puzzle snapping into place. First came knowledge, the deed. Proof. Then would come strategy. Timing. Execution. The letter arrived on a Monday, folded neatly into a white HOA envelope with their insignia printed in smug blue ink across the corner. I found it stuffed into my mailbox, the paper stiff as if authority itself had been baked into its fibers. I didn't need to open it to know what it said. Still, I slid it carefully with my pocket knife and unfolded the pages at my kitchen table. Second notice. The words screamed from the header, bold and underlined. The text below was written in the clinical, almost gleeful language of petty tyrants. Failure to comply with the directive to remove your vessel constitutes a violation of HOA Regulation Section 3.4. Further noncompliance will result in escalation, including but not limited to fines, liens, and potential legal action. Legal action. I chuckled softly. The arrogance of it. They still thought this was a game of fines and votes. They had no idea they were writing threats on paper that meant nothing compared to the one locked in my safe. I read it twice, then folded it back along its creases. I didn't bother to draft a reply. Instead, I slipped it into a drawer with the first notice. 2 artifacts for the record. two markers of how far they were willing to push. That night, as I sipped coffee by the window and watched the moon ripple across the lake, I decided it was time to stop humoring them. My grandfather used to say, "Never fight with your fists when your land can fight for you." The deed wasn't just paper. It was a weapon sharper than any blade, heavier than any hammer. The next morning, I drove into town. The hardware store owner raised an eyebrow as I carried a stack of pre-ordered aluminum signs to the counter. White backgrounds, bold red lettering, each one clear and unforgiving. Private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. The kind of signs people didn't argue with. By the time the sun began to rise the following day, I was already out on the shoreline with a post driver and steel stakes. The ground was damp with dew, the lake mist rising in sheets that clung to my boots. Birds stirred in the trees, their morning calls mixing with the metallic clang of steel sinking into earth. One by one, I planted the signs. At every access point, every fishing dock, every sandy stretch where families like to swim. The aluminum caught the early light, glowing like warnings written by the dawn itself. By 7 a.m., the shoreline was armored, and by 8 a.m., the first voices rose in confusion. I watched from my porch as two teenagers, fishing rods in hand, stopped dead at the end of the pier when they saw the sign bolted into the post beside it. They frowned, exchanged nervous whispers, and walked away, rods dragging uselessly at their sides. By 9, parents were pulling their children out of the water. Mothers wrapped towels tightly around their kids, shooting glances at the signs as if they were barbed wire. A group of joggers stopped mid-route, clustering in a knot, pointing toward the new warnings and shaking their heads in disbelief. By 10, the anger began. I could hear it from across the lake. Raised voices demanding explanations. Some tried to peel the signs off, only to find I'd bolted them in deep. Others stormed back to their homes, muttering about calling Harold, about handling this nonsense. And by noon, the storm reached me directly. My phone lit up on the table like a bonfire. Call after call, name after name. Harold, Martha, numbers I didn't recognize but knew belonged to angry residents. Each one left voicemails dripping with fury, confusion, and disbelief. "Cole, what the hell do you think you're doing? You can't just put up signs like that. This is community property. You're going to regret this if you don't take them down immediately." I let the phone buzz, ring, and scream until the battery ran low. I didn't answer a single one. Instead, I sat on my porch with a fresh glass of iced tea, the lake stretching calm and endless before me. From where I sat, I could see residents pacing along their shorelines, pointing at the signs, phones pressed to their ears as if summoning an army. The chaos was almost beautiful. They thought they could frighten me with letters. They thought rules scribbled in binders could outweigh ink pressed into parchment 70 years ago. But now they were learning the truth. This wasn't their playground. This wasn't their community pool. This was my lake, and I just closed the gates. The morning air was sharp with the scent of wet grass, the kind of dampness that clings to wood and metal. I was on my porch, sipping coffee, when I saw them gathering across the shoreline. A crowd of neighbors clustered together, their voices low but urgent, their eyes darting toward my dock like it was the site of some public execution. At the center of them was Harold Whitaker, shoulders puffed out, his face already flushed crimson with fury. Even from a distance, I could tell he was shouting, gesturing wildly toward my boat, toward the shoreline, toward the signs that gleamed in the sunlight. His arms cut through the air like he was swatting invisible flies, whipping the crowd into agitation. Then he broke from the group, storming down the wooden planks of my dock. Harold looked like a man ready to tear something apart with his bare hands. His cheap leather shoes slapped against the boards, and the water beneath creaked and swayed with each angry step. By the time he reached me, his forehead was slick with sweat, his jaw trembling with rage. "You can't do this," he barked, his voice carrying across the water. "This is community property, damn it. You don't have the right." Behind him, the crowd edged closer, their murmurs rising like the hum of bees. Mothers clutched their children, fishermen crossed their arms, joggers and dog walkers leaned in for the spectacle. I could feel their hunger for a fight, their need to see Harold put me in my place. But I didn't rise. Instead, I set my mug down on the railing and reached calmly into the folder resting on the porch table. I withdrew a single sheet of paper, aged, yellow, but crisp in its protective sleeve. A copy, not the original, but sharp enough to cut through the lies Harold was peddling. I held it out to him with steady fingers. "Read carefully," I said, my voice quiet but razor sharp. "You've been trespassing for years." For a moment, Harold hesitated. His eyes flicked to the page like a man eyeing a snake. Then, with a snarl, he snatched it from my hand. His grip was too tight, crumpling the corners as though he could damage the words themselves by sheer force. The crowd hushed. The only sound was the soft lapping of the lake against the dock. Harold's eyes scanned the paper, jumping from line to line, lips moving as he read under his breath. I saw the moment the truth struck him. His fingers tightened, his knuckles whitened, and the flush drained from his face as if the lake itself had stolen his blood. "No," he whispered, barely audible. "No, this can't be right." But it was. His hand shook as he read the embossed county seal, the signatures, the date, August 3rd, 1954. My grandfather's name etched into permanence. The words that declared not just the land, but the water, the shoreline, the rights to every dock and every ripple. The whispers began to spread through the crowd. "Is it true? Does he really own it? My God, we've been fishing here for years. What about the HOA rules?" The murmurs grew restless, heavy with doubt and fear. Neighbors who had stood behind Harold now shifted uneasily, their confidence crumbling. Mothers pulled their children a little closer, as though proximity to the truth itself might burn. I watched Harold's jaw clench and unclench, the paper trembling in his grasp. He wanted to deny it, to tear it up, to shout me down. But the words on that page were iron, and iron does not bend to shouting. "Go ahead," I said softly, almost kindly. "Show them. Let them all see what you've been standing on." Harold's eyes darted to the crowd. He knew, if he handed them the paper, the silence stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Finally, Harold's hand dropped to his side, the paper still trembling in his grip. He looked smaller now, deflated, his shoulders slumping under the weight of truth. Behind him, the crowd buzzed louder, the tide of belief shifting, breaking against him. I stepped closer, my voice low but carrying across the dock. "You wanted to fight, Harold. You wanted to drag me in front of everyone and humiliate me. But you never asked yourself one question. Who does the lake belong to?" The crowd leaned in. I let the words hang before finishing. "Now you have your answer." The HOA had tasted humiliation, but they weren't done. People like Harold never backed down after losing face. They doubled down. I knew this wasn't over the moment. I saw the way he avoided my eyes after our last confrontation, his jaw tight, his lips pressed in a thin white line as he shuffled the deed papers back into my hands. Pride was his poison, and now it was driving him straight into a war he couldn't win. The first strike came quietly. One night, just after midnight, I heard the low growl of engines outside. I stepped onto my porch, the cold boards creaking under my bare feet, and spotted two SUV headlights parked across from my property. They didn't move. Their silhouettes sat like vultures, watching. The next night it happened again, only this time, it wasn't just headlights. It was the official-looking SUV that carried the HOA's so-called neighborhood security. A man in a reflective vest sat inside, arms crossed, pretending to be on patrol. They weren't patrolling. They were posturing. The message was clear. We're watching you. You're outnumbered. I didn't flinch. Instead, I went inside, opened my laptop, and pulled up my newly installed wireless camera feeds. 4 new security cameras now dotted my property, one covering the dock, one angled toward the shoreline, one on the driveway, and one hidden high in the old oak tree, giving me a panoramic view of everything. Every SUV, every shadow, every neighbor sneaking too close, recorded in crisp detail. By the third night, they escalated. A group of teenagers, clearly sent or at least encouraged by the HOA, snuck down to the water. I watched on my screen as they tried to launch kayaks from my shoreline. They laughed, loud and cocky, tossing beer cans into the water as if they owned the place. When I stepped outside, the dock light clicked on, flooding the shoreline in a harsh yellow glare. They froze. They scattered like frightened deer, tripping over one another as they scrambled back toward the cul-de-sac. I picked up one of the empty cans they'd left behind, set it on my railing, and thought to myself, every move they make just builds my case stronger. By the end of the week, I had a thick file of evidence, videos, photos, logs of suspicious cars parked by my property, and detailed notes of the incidents. I even went down to the sheriff's office and filed multiple trespass reports. The deputy on duty, a grizzled man named Carter, who'd been in the county longer than most of the HOA residents had been alive, gave me a slow grin as I handed him the paperwork. They don't realize what they've stepped into, do they? He asked. No, I said, sliding the reports across the counter. But they will. Good. Because Harold and his board? They've been acting like they run this town. It's about time someone clipped their wings. Word spread faster than I could have predicted. By the weekend, whispers rippled through the community. Rumors that I was hoarding the lake, that I was plotting to drain it, that I was planning to sell the water rights to a corporation. I even overheard one woman at the grocery store mutter that I was planning to turn the entire lake into a private fishing resort for rich outsiders. All lies, all seated carefully by Harold's inner circle. But rumors are weak weapons when you have proof. So I played it cool. I didn't rise to their bait, didn't storm into their meetings to argue. Instead, I mailed Harold and the entire HOA board certified letters, each one stamped, notarized, and carrying my attorney's letterhead. The message was short and sharp. Cease and desist from trespassing, spreading defamatory statements, and attempting to interfere with private property. Continued actions will result in civil and criminal proceedings. I knew Harold would hate that. A man like him thrived on bluster and intimidation, not cold, hard paperwork. Sure enough, the next morning, Harold came stomping down the cul-de-sac like a man on fire, clutching the unopened envelope in his fist. His face was crimson. He pounded on my gate, barking loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. You think you can scare me with legal letters? You think you can own our water? He shouted, spittle flying. You're nothing but a selfish squatter. I let him rant. Didn't open the gate. Just stood on my porch with a cup of coffee, calm as the surface of the lake behind me. Finally, when he paused for breath, I lifted my phone. You're trespassing right now, Harold. Keep talking. The sheriff will enjoy this recording. For the first time, I saw hesitation flicker in his eyes. He turned, stomped off, but not before yelling over his shoulder. "This isn't over." Of course it wasn't. A few nights later, I caught something even more desperate on my cameras. Two men creeping along the shoreline, dressed in dark hoodies, dragging a canoe to the water. They thought the cover of darkness would protect them. They were wrong. I hit the floodlights, bathing them in blinding white light. The men froze, caught like deer. "Private property," my voice boomed through the outdoor speakers I'd wired to the system. "You're being recorded. Law enforcement has been notified." They bolted, abandoning the canoe halfway in the water. By the time the deputy arrived, I had already handed over the footage and pointed to the irony. Every sign, every photo, every video of those protests only made my case stronger. They weren't residents exercising rights. They were trespassers, violating the boundaries of land clearly marked as mine. I had hours of footage to prove it. Meanwhile, my lawyer, a sharp, steel-nerved woman named Avery, was already preparing motions. "The more they harass you," she said, flipping through the growing stack of evidence, "the more damages we can claim. Keep documenting. Keep provoking them into mistakes. They're hanging themselves with their own rope." And so I did. Every new trespass, every false rumor, every angry protest became another thread in the net I was weaving around Harold and his empire. Still, I knew one thing for certain. Harold wasn't the kind of man who admitted defeat. No, he was the kind who would fight to the bitter end, no matter how much blood he spilled along the way. The battle for the lake had only just begun, and I was ready for every move. The inevitable came in a thick white envelope, hand-delivered by a process server who seemed almost apologetic as he walked up my driveway. "Sorry, sir," he muttered, handing me the packet. "Just doing my job." I flipped through the papers right there on the porch. The HOA, spearheaded by Harold and his cronies, had filed a lawsuit demanding the court strip me of lake rights, citing community access traditions, fair use, and even aesthetic harmony. The phrases were laughable, stitched together like a patchwork quilt of desperation. But beneath the ridiculousness, I could feel their arrogance pressing through the legal jargon. They actually think they can erase 70 years of ownership with one motion. I smiled. "Good luck," I whispered to myself, preparing for battle. The following days were a blur of paperwork and strategy sessions with Avery, my attorney. She was the kind of lawyer who carried storms in her eyes, sharp, relentless, and terrifyingly calm under pressure. While Harold relied on bluster and rumor, Avery relied on facts and precision. We sat at my kitchen table late into the night, the deed spread out between us like a holy artifact. Its yellowed pages bore the ink of 1954, my grandfather's signature neat and bold, the county recorder's stamp pressed deep into the paper. Alongside it were tax receipts, water rights documentation, maps, and affidavits that stretched back decades. "They don't stand a chance," Avery said, tapping her pen against the deed. "But they're hoping you'll cave before it gets to court." HOA lawsuits are designed to exhaust people, drain them financially, wear them down until they give in. I leaned back, a slow grin spreading across my face. "They picked the wrong man. I've been waiting for this fight." She smiled too, just barely. "Good, because once we step into that courtroom, it won't just be about you and Harold. It'll be about every smug HOA board member in this county who thinks they can bully landowners. You're about to set a precedent." The day arrives. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and old paper. The ceilings were high, the air stale, and the echo of footsteps lingered in every corridor. I walked in wearing my best suit, calm as still water, while Harold and his board shuffled in ahead of me, their whispers sharp and smug. They sat at their table like kings on thrones, adjusting ties, whispering jokes, and smirking as if victory were already assured. Harold, of course, was front and center, puffed up like a rooster, his smug grin plastered across his face. He made a point of glancing back at me, raising his eyebrows as if to say, "This is my arena." I didn't blink. Avery stood beside me, papers in hand, her expression unreadable. "You ready?" she asked quietly. "More than ready." Opening moves. The judge entered, robes flowing, gavel in hand. Everyone rose. "Be seated." The courtroom settled, the tension heavy enough to choke on. The HOA's lawyer, a slick man in a tailored gray suit named Whitaker, wasted no time. He rose, cleared his throat, and launched into a rehearsed monologue about community interests, collective rights, and long-standing traditions of public access. His voice dripped with confidence, as though the outcome was already written in stone. "For decades," Whitaker proclaimed, gesturing dramatically toward the gallery where HOA members sat, "the families of this community have swum, fished, and boated on this lake without interference. The defendant now seeks to disrupt this harmony, hoard resources, and rob children of their birthright to enjoy nature." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Harold sat back with a smug smile, clearly savoring every word. When Whitaker finished, Avery stood slowly, her movements deliberate, and placed the deed gently on the podium, as if she were presenting a crown jewel. "My client is not robbing anyone of their birthright," she began, her voice steady, cutting through the room like a blade. "He is simply exercising the rights that have been his family's for over 70 years. Rights that are legally documented, notarized, and recorded by the county office in 1954. She lifted the deed for the judge to see. The yellowed pages seemed to glow under the courtroom lights. "This document is not tradition. It is not rumor. It is law." The turning point. The judge leaned forward, squinting at the papers. "Approach." Avery handed over the deed, along with copies of tax receipts and water rights documents. The judge flipped through them carefully, silence filling the room. Harold's smugness began to crack. His foot tapped nervously against the floor. Whitaker shifted in his seat, beads of sweat forming at his temple. "Mr. Whitaker," the judge said finally, adjusting his glasses, "do you have evidence that supersedes this deed?" Whitaker cleared his throat. "Your Honor, while the deed does exist, we contend that." "You contend?" The judge's voice was sharp. "This deed is valid, notarized, and on record with the county for over 70 years. Contention is not law." The gallery fell silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Avery's lips curled into the faintest smile. She didn't need to say another word. The verdict. The judge set the papers down, folded his hands, and leaned back in his chair. "This case is not complicated," he said firmly. "The lake and its water rights are, and always have been, private property. Ownership belongs." The board members looked like children scolded in public, small, embarrassed, and suddenly very aware of the watching eyes in the gallery. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply stood, nodded to Avery, and walked out of the courtroom with the deed under my arm. Behind me, I could hear Harold's voice rising in protest, whining to his lawyer, demanding appeals, desperate for some way to claw back the power he'd just lost. But it was too late. The law had spoken. Aftermath. Outside the courthouse, the press had gathered, local reporters hungry for a story. The verdict spread faster than wildfire. By the time I made it home from the courthouse, half the neighborhood already knew the truth. Phones buzzed, group chats exploded, and whispers spread like cracks through glass. The HOA had lost. Worse, they hadn't just lost quietly. They had been humiliated, crushed under the weight of a 70-year-old deed that none of their smug posturing could erase. By the next morning, the ripple effects were everywhere. The cracks in the foundation. At sunrise, I took my coffee to the porch and watched as Harold's prized minions gathered at the clubhouse for an emergency meeting. They marched in with clipboards and angry faces, but they didn't march out the same way. 40 minutes later, the first couple stormed out, shouting so loudly I could hear every word across the water. "You wasted our money, Harold. Do you know how much of our dues went into that lawsuit?" A man's voice bellowed. His wife trailed behind, shaking her head in disgust. Minutes later, another family left, their teenage son muttering, "Guess we're not swimming this summer." Hans, Hua. By mid-morning, the trickle had turned into a flood. Families walked away one by one, their frustration boiling over. It wasn't just the lawsuit. It was years of Harold's arrogance, years of fines for uncut lawns, warnings about mailbox colors, petty threats over flower beds. The court ruling had ripped the mask off, and now everyone saw Harold for what he was, a bully who had cost them dearly. The exodus. By the end of the week, resignation letters piled up on the board's table. Over half the homeowners had officially withdrawn from the HOA, citing gross mismanagement, financial irresponsibility, and loss of trust. Without dues, the coffers began to dry up. No more budget for security patrols. No more money for beautification projects. Even the landscaping service stopped showing up after 2 missed payments. The once pristine lawns began to grow shaggy. The flower beds wilted. The pool at the clubhouse, once Harold's pride and joy, sat empty, a cracked basin collecting rainwater and leaves. And the lake, my lake, remained off-limits, a shimmering reminder of everything they had lost. The neighborhood in decline. It didn't take long for the housing market to notice. Realtors began whispering to potential buyers that the lake was private property, inaccessible to residents without my permission. For families who had bought homes based on the promise of lakeside living, it was a death blow. Property values are dropping. I overheard one man mutter bitterly to his wife outside the grocery store. All because Harold picked the wrong fight. The once coveted community was now branded with a stigma. What use was a lake community without access to the lake? Harold's disappearance. And then there was Harold. For years, he had been everywhere, strutting down the streets, clipboard in hand, barking orders, finding families for weeds or cracked driveways. His presence was as constant as the mail. Now, he was gone. Neighbors whispered that he hadn't left his house in days. His car, once washed to a shine every Saturday, sat dusty in the driveway. The man who had once thrived on being the center of attention couldn't even look people in the eye. I saw him once, just once after the ruling. He shuffled down his driveway to grab the mail, shoulders hunched, eyes darting like a man expecting stones to be thrown. When he spotted me across the water, sipping coffee on my dock, he froze. Our eyes met for half a second before he turned and hurried back inside, clutching the envelopes like a shield. The king had been dethroned. The silence of power lost. The HOA meetings stopped altogether. The bulletin boards that once brimmed with memos and threats remained blank, their pushpins rusting in the humid air. The weekly patrol SUVs vanished, replaced only by the lives without oversight. The silence was profound. For years, the lakefront had been a place of constant tension. Arguments, demands, gossip, whispers of fines. Now it was quiet. The water rippled in the breeze, free of shouts and splashing children. No one dared set foot on the docks without my permission. The once busy shoreline was deserted, reclaimed by herons and ducks. And for the first time in decades, the lake was truly peaceful. My mornings on the water, those mornings became my ritual. I'd rise before the sun, brew a pot of coffee, and walk barefoot to the dock. The air was cool, the mist rising off the lake like smoke from a slumbering giant. I'd cast a line, listening to the steady drip of water against the wood, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. No shouting, no arguments, no HOA patrols circling like sharks. Just me, the water, and the memory of my grandfather who had entrusted me with this place. Sometimes I'd row out to the center, the oars cutting through the still water, and pause there. Looking back at the houses, silent, their residents trapped in the consequences of Harold's hubris, I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. This was always my lake. I held the notice in my hand for a long while, then folded it neatly and slipped it into the same safe where the deed rested. One chapter of the lake story was over, and I had won. Epilogue to collapse. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, Harold had acted like a king, ruling over his neighbors with threats and paperwork. In the end, it was paperwork, my grandfather's deed, that undid him. Now, the lake belonged to me in more ways than one. Not just legally, but spiritually. The community had collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance, leaving me alone with the prize they had fought so desperately to control. And I enjoyed every moment of the peace they had given me, simply by losing. By the time summer reached its peak, the neighborhood was on the edge of mutiny. Not against me, but against themselves. With the HOA dissolved and the lake legally locked under my control, families found themselves staring at a cruel reality. The very water that had drawn them to this community was now forbidden to them. The kids who once raced to the shoreline after school were left sitting on porches, restless and bored. The fishermen who had bragged about their catches now drove miles to other lakes, returning bitter and sunburnt. Canoes sat rotting in backyards, sails flapped and used in garages, and the promise of lakeside living had turned into a cruel joke. At first, they tried ignoring me, pretending the court ruling was just a bad dream. A few daring souls snuck onto the water in the early dawn hours, but my cameras caught them, and Avery's cease and desist letters landed on their doorsteps before the week was out. After the third violation, Deputy Carter himself showed up to issue trespassing warnings. That scared most of them straight. By July, silence reigned over the shoreline. But silence breeds desperation. The approach. It was a humid Tuesday evening when the first knock came. 3 of them stood at my gate. Mr. Caldwell, whose daughter used to host birthday parties on her family's dock. Mrs. Finnegan, whose grandkids had been banned from the lake since the verdict. And young Mr. Liu, who had only moved in 2 years ago and was already regretting the purchase. Their faces carried the same expression, discomfort wrapped in forced politeness. Evening, Caldwell began, clearing his throat. We were hoping to talk. I didn't invite them in right away. I let them stew a little, watch them shuffle on their feet like school children outside a principal's office. Finally, I nodded and led them down to the dock, where the lake shimmered behind me like a crown. We sat. They fumbled. And then Caldwell finally said it. What if we pay you an annual fee for lake access? The words hung heavy in the air, shifting the power. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. These were the same neighbors who had once whispered behind my back, who had cheered Harold on when he demanded I move my boat, who had joined his protests with handmade signs. Now, they were petitioners, supplicants at the edge of my dock, hat in hand. Maybe, I said slowly, but things have changed. If I allow access, it'll be under my rules. My lake, my law. Their eyes flickered nervously. Of course, Mrs. Finnegan said quickly. That seems reasonable. I let the silence stretch before I continued. No loud parties. No harassment. Every household signs an agreement. Strict hours, strict conduct. And Harold, I paused, watching their faces tighten. He's banned for life. The words landed like stones dropped in still water. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably, but no one argued. They all knew Harold was finished. He had cost them too much. Finally, Lou cleared his throat. We agree. The negotiation. Word spread fast. Within a week, nearly a dozen residents had joined the talks. We held a meeting on my dock. Ironic, considering that just months ago I had been barred from theirs. They sat in folding chairs, papers in hand, sweating in the evening sun as Avery outlined the terms. Annual access fee, she said crisply, paid directly to my client. Failure to comply with lake rules results in immediate revocation. Violations will be enforced as trespassing. Any disputes will be settled by arbitration, with my client holding final authority. The neighbors squirmed, but no one objected. They needed the lake more than the lake needed them. Think of it this way, I added, sipping my coffee. The agreement. By August, contracts were signed. Households that wanted access paid the fee, signed the conduct rules, and received laminated passes granting them entry. Those who refused were left out, their kids watching from the shore as others swam. For the first time, the lake had order, my order. Fishing hours were posted. Noise limits were enforced. Docks had to be maintained according to my guidelines. No late-night parties, no trespassing beyond designated areas, no harassment of wildlife. Avery had made the contracts ironclad. And Harold? He was nowhere to be found. When Caldwell nervously asked what to do if Harold tried to show up, I smiled. He won't. But if he does, call me. I'll handle it. From enemy to gatekeeper. It was and so, I banned him in absentia. A name written in bold letters at the top of every contract. Harold Simmons, no access. Leif Diambon. The neighbors signed without hesitation. Quiet victory. By the time the leaves began to turn, the deal was complete. The lake was mine in every sense, owned, managed, and ruled. The residents paid for the privilege of what they once took for granted, and they did so under my rules, not Harold's. I still rose early, taking my coffee to the dock, the mist curling around me like an old friend. But now, when I saw children swimming or neighbors casting lines, it wasn't a threat to my peace. It was tribute, proof of the balance I had restored. I had defended my family's legacy. I had broken the tyrant. And now, I was more than just a man by the water. I was the landlord of the lake. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced in this neighborhood. The same people who once jeered at me in meetings whispered insults behind my back and signed letters demanding that I bow to their will were suddenly quiet. Too quiet. The lake had become a symbol. For decades, it had been the crown jewel of their suburban pride, the sparkling centerpiece of every brochure the HOA sent to prospective buyers, the backdrop of their family barbecues and summer parties. They believed it belonged to them. They believed it was theirs to police, to flaunt, to regulate. But now, every ripple, every fish, every shadow under the water answered only to me. A sunset different from the rest. One evening, I sat at the edge of my dock, a cold drink sweating in my hand, while the sky bled into shades of orange, crimson, and violet. The boat rocked gently at my side, the same boat they once tried to evict. The wood beneath me felt warmer than usual, as if the lake itself was alive, embracing me for defending it. The world was hushed, save for the rhythmic lap of water against the posts and the occasional cry of a loon cutting through the dusk. No shouting neighbors, no HOA patrols, no heralds storming down the dock, waving papers and threats. Just peace. I let the silence linger, breathing in the damp air, my chest finally free of the tight coil of anger that had lived there for months. In that moment, I wasn't just a homeowner. I was the keeper of something much larger, something that would outlive every petty rule and power struggle. The shift in power, the change in the community was almost comical. Families who once turned their backs when I passed now offered tight, polite nods. Some even waved, though their eyes revealed the bitterness they tried to hide. They had become my tenants, whether they admitted it or not. The irony wasn't lost on me. His cronies held power, but their castle was built on sand. With one old deed, yellowed with age but ironclad in law, I had pulled the ground out from under them. Now, every summer barbecue required my permission. Every child who wanted to swim needed me to say yes. Every boat, paddleboard, or fishing line depended on my rules. And most poetic part? They paid me for the privilege. Harold's exile. As for Harold, the self-proclaimed king of the neighborhood, he vanished. Word was that he sold his house at a loss and moved 2 towns over. His downfall was as quiet as his reign had been loud. The same man who once wagged his finger in my face, who spoke in booming declarations at meetings as if he were addressing a royal court, couldn't even bear to show his face in public after the humiliation. His name became a bitter joke whispered at block parties. Parents told their kids not to pull a Harold. And me? I had been the one to exile him, not with fists or shouts, but with a single sheet of paper that proved he'd been nothing but a trespasser for years. Grandfather's legacy. That night on the dock, I pulled the deed from his leather case and spread it carefully across my lap. The paper was brittle, its edges browned, its ink slightly faded, but it carried weight. My grandfather's name was there in bold strokes, alongside the county's seal and the date, 1954. I imagined him standing on this very shoreline 70 years ago, maybe in a plaid jacket, pipe smoke curling around his face as he signed the papers that would ripple through time to this very moment. He wasn't just buying land and water rights. He was securing a legacy. It struck me then that my victory wasn't mine alone. It belonged to him too. He had known the value of this lake when others didn't. He had known it was more than a body of water. It was a crown, and whoever held it would hold power. He had passed that. Being king of the lake wasn't about throwing my weight around or barking orders. It was subtler than that. My power was felt in whispers, in the quiet compliance of neighbors who now thought twice before crossing me. It was in the way the HOA no longer dared to print pictures of the lake on their flyers. It was in the silence of the water itself. The rules I had set, no loud parties, no harassment, no herald, were followed without complaint. Parents reminded their kids. Neighbors reminded each other. They didn't follow because they respected me. They followed because they had no choice. And strangely, that suited me just fine. The lake at night. Sometimes, late at night, I'd take my boat out alone. The water would stretch black and endless beneath me. The stars reflected like shards of glass. The air would be cool and still, carrying the faint smell of pine. In those moments, it felt like the lake spoke. The creak of the oars, the gentle slap of water against the hull, even the distant call of owls. It was as though the world was reminding me, this is yours. You fought for it. You kept it safe. The loneliness I once feared became a kind of throne room silence. The lake didn't need an audience. It didn't need applause. It was mine, and that was enough. The smile. And so, whenever I hear the water lap against the shore, I smile. It isn't the smile of a conqueror reveling in victory. It isn't the smug grin of a man who proved others wrong. It's quieter than that, deeper. It's the smile of someone who knows that no matter how many rules are written, no matter how many committees form, no matter how many heralds rise and fall, this lake, this quiet expanse of water, will always belong to me. My grandfather gave me more than property. He gave me foresight. He gave me freedom. He gave me victory. And when I sit at the edge of the dock, the sunset painting the water gold, the boat rocking gently beside me, I know one truth.